Hello and welcome to the weekly commodity market update. I'm Brownfield anchor Will Robinson, joined as always by University of Missouri's Ben Brown. Hey, Ben.
Good morning, Will. How are you?
Not too bad. We just got back from Commodity Classic, which is probably the biggest farm show I've ever seen. So I can't complain. It's a pretty exciting trip.
No, I'm pretty jealous of you. It's a great conference, great opportunity, and I'm sure you had some good food while you were down there as well.
No, so I got to have oysters and crawfish for the first time, so that was pretty good. But anyway, as always, starting off the show here, can you give me a market overview? What did we see from the past week?
Sure can. So for old crop corn for the May contract, down 2 cents to $7.48 on the week. New crop corn was up 10 cents to $6.52. Old crop soybeans for May up 11 cents to $16.70. New crop soybeans for November up 28 cents. The different components for that soybean complex, soybean oil was down 0.3 cents to 73, almost 74 cents per pound. And then soybean meal up $25.60 per short ton. Looking at the wheat complex, we saw wheat prices on change almost down $2 for that old crop May contract down to $10.96. And then that new crop July wheat contract down $1.82 to $10.70. So a pretty wild week on wheat again, after being up big last week, down big this week.
So what were the market drivers that really led to those changes?
Yeah, good question. So at least on the wheat complex, wheat just got in a case of a short squeeze. And so we saw the wheat prices continue to escalate as those short positions had to rebuy back into the market. Buying back into the market then pushed the price higher and caused the same exact thing with people of higher prices. So until we finally got that last short position out of the market, the market continued to move up, but then we certainly see it downfall last week towards the end of the week especially. So a couple other highlights on the week. USDA's monthly supply and demand estimates reduced South American soybean production and exports. We also saw exports reduced out of the Black Sea region for Ukraine and Russia, and increased demand for U.S. corn and soybeans. U.S. ethanol production was up 31,000 barrels per day for the most recent week of data. Ethanol stocks also increased, pushing down ethanol price just slightly. We had a very strong week of U.S. export sales. Corn came in at a weekly record for this marketing year. Soybeans saw their second best week of the marketing year. However, that's not really transitioning into weekly export inspections just yet. Weekly U.S. export inspections were down for corn and wheat, flat for soybeans, slightly up for grain sorghum. And then finally, just back to wheat for just a second. On Monday of this week, we saw wheat kind of turn the corner and rally a little bit midday, as we got rumors that Russia might be banning the exports of wheat through the end of June. And so after being down early in the day, wheat rallied to be positive for part of the day and then finished up in negative territory by the time closing happened Monday afternoon.
Well, Ben, last week we had the World Ag Supply and Demand Estimates from USDA released. Did you see any real big surprises in that report?
No, not really. Not really a lot of surprises if you step back and think about it for just a second. There was obviously the big ones that people were watching for. South America production this time of year is always a big driver, but especially in a year when we've seen as much challenges for that crop, and especially on the soybean side is what we've seen. So USDA lowered South American soybean production 9.5 million metric tons for three countries, Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. We also saw exports out of the region reduce 6.5 million metric tons. Probably the biggest surprise, if there was a surprise for the day, is most of the trade, and I think many people were expecting a downward revision in global wheat stocks. We actually saw global wheat stocks increase on the month. And if you step back and think about it, it's probably not as surprising. We did see trade out of the region, of the Black Sea region, limited. Ukraine wheat exports were reduced 4 million metric tons. Russian wheat exports were reduced 3 million metric tons. However, almost all that was then recouped in the ending stocks. Maybe a little bit more domestic demand on lower prices, but all that ended up in ending stocks. So it didn't disappear. It just ended up in ending stocks. And then certainly we saw increased production for Australia, 2 million metric ton increase for them. and almost all the global shifts in wheat exports or wheat trade came out of Australia and India. So again, probably a little bit surprising if you were expecting a decrease in global wheat ending stocks, but finished up. On the domestic side, we saw USDA increase domestic corn use for ethanol 25 million bushels. They could have gone higher, but I think there's some things that led them to keep that maybe a little bit restrained for this month. And then U.S. corn demand for the export side was increased 75 million bushels. U.S. soybean export demand was increased 40 million bushels. So all at the end of the day, all said and done, corn increased 20 cents on the marketing year per bushel. Soybeans increased 25 cents for the season average price, and then wheat was up 20 cents to $7.50 per bushel for that season average price.
So, Ben, looking ahead, a lot of the conversation going into this planting season in fall, it's been centered around how tight the market is and how little, carryover we have right now. So, really looking at the WASDE from last week, is that going to really change that outlook?
No, I think the report didn't give any indication of tightening. And I think that was maybe why I was a little bearish, actually, of the market when it came out last week. However, I will categorize and say this probably was a good indication of how tight stocks could get this summer again, especially as we head into the summer months here in the United States. The expectation of, given how much export demand we've seen for U.S. soybeans compared to some of our competition for later in the summer months. Some of our domestic crushers could be fighting against the export market to really build up enough supplies to cover their needs this summer. So the soybean market could get really tight here domestically. Does that transition to higher futures prices? Maybe not, but does it support some higher basis prices? It possibly could, as some of those end users start to bid for supplies.
So we've seen a lot of issues in shipping. Can you give me an update there? What are we really seeing within the market? How well are things being able to get from point A to point B right now?
Well, so the story earlier this year was on the ocean freights and how high ocean freights and bulk carriers have got, especially at ports where they were ultra congested. Some of that dialogue is now shifted to internal domestic shipping and transportation logistics. And this shows up in basis bids. I think part of the reason why we've seen basis bids across the country really drop the last week to 2 weeks is largely due to this role transportation and logistics plays in getting grain and oilseeds from, as you said, point A to point B. Just a couple of numbers here to pull out. Transportation and logistics, do represent a portion of basis. It's not all. Interest rate figures into that, and then local supply and demand as well. But secondary shuttle freight rates for rail carriers, especially in the Upper Plains, continue to increase. Last week, Burlington Northern Santa Fe reported that in North Dakota alone, there was about 1,300 cars that were 1 to 10 days past due, and a little over 1,700 cars that were more than 11 days past due. So we've certainly seen the rail market, that secondary rail market, really heat up. But then barge rates have also heated up as well, especially in the Ohio and Illinois river valleys. Barge rate, which is indexed, USDA provides us those index, reached their highest level since 2014. And we saw on the Illinois River, barge rates up 45% higher last week than the week before, 140% higher than they were a year ago, and 118% higher than the 3-year average. So again, some challenges on the barge transportation. And even today, we still have some high water restrictions in place in the Ohio and lower Mississippi region.
Looking how that passes down, so just within transportation costs, we're seeing, these big spikes in gas prices. How much of a wrench is that really throwing into transportation?
A lot, actually. That's part of the coin. It's not all of it. Labor is also a challenge and continues to be a factor when we're trying to find people to drive trucks and get grain moved across the country over the road, but even to find barge captains to get grain down the river. So labor and fuel both playing a role there.
So referring back to Commodity Classic from last week, a lot of the talking points that I heard from ag groups, especially on the corn side, was that increasing biofuel blends from E10 to E15, making E15 the baseline, just doing that would really make up for the losses that we're seeing because of the lack of Russian oil coming into to the U.S. into other markets. Really, what do you have to say kind of on that talking point, and does that hold water?
So it's a great talking point. It certainly gets people that are tied to corn and tied to ethanol production really excited, because I think it makes sense. And ethanol has always had this connection with growers at a much higher level than exports ever had, because it's tangible. You can take your corn to an ethanol facility and quote unquote see your corn get turned into ethanol. It's much harder to see that corn reach an end destination that's halfway around the world. So ethanol's always had this emotional connection for corn growers and ethanol producers as well. Is it possible to do that? I'm never going to say anything's not possible, but it's not something that's going to happen overnight. The infrastructure in place is designed for E10 blends. And so a couple of the things that would have to change before we could even start talking about E15 is the EPA would have to approve some of our holding tanks that we have in the ground at a lot of these gas stations for E15 use. We'd have to think about, and we'd have to get over the hurdle that E15 currently isn't allowed year round. It's currently not allowed in summer months in certain places due to the reed vapor pressure associated with it. So that's a challenge. We've got like I said, the regulatory issues of the tanks themselves. Not every vehicle, even though the majority, almost all vehicles can use E15. There's still some that can't use E15, so you still have to provide an E10 source to those that can't, and that might mean separate tanks for E15 and E10. So I don't want to say it's not possible, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. And the market structure that we have in place to help people transition to E15 is through the RIN market. That's the whole purpose of the RIN market that's associated with ethanol, is when RIN prices get to a certain point, that's the market telling retailers, hey, we're going to give you the incentive to invest in these higher blends of ethanol sources. And certainly that's the reason it was set up to comply. So just from a logistical standpoint on the infrastructure, there's many of challenges that prevent this from happening overnight. The second thing is, right now we still have a system where oil producers kind of get to dictate kind of their makeup of their oil. If they want, they don't have to blend ethanol into their oil. They can just buy the RIN prices or the RINs and turn those into the EPA. They don't, because ethanol is the cheapest source of octane. And so just about every gallon of gasoline that we consume comes with some level of ethanol, just because it's the cheapest source of octane for the gas. And if we did away with the RFS tomorrow, we would still be using we'd still be using a lot of ethanol. Flip that to the other side. No oil company is going to give up their margin share voluntarily right now. They're dealing with slower output, but they're trying to capture as much revenue as they possibly can from these higher prices. So they're not going to give up their market share to ethanol on the front side either. And so we've got some challenges to make E15 work. It's difficult to see how this system actually could be put into place in any quick form of matter.
Thinking about year-round E15, if it were available year-round in all markets in the U.S., what would be the impacts? Would it have a large impact on gas prices?
On gas prices? Mm-hmm. Well, so certainly you would see at the pump a cheaper source of gas with E15 than E10. The question then becomes translating that into the mileage penalty, if you will, in terms of E10. Does that back off? In a market, if markets are working efficiently, E15 would be priced at the same amount of energy utilized from that gallon as E10. And so, yes, you're not going to go as far, but it's going to be cheaper to buy, and those should be in balance. If they're not, there's room for arbitrage.
So really the only differential that you'd see between ethanol and, just what's known as, I guess, standard gasoline the only premium that gas would have is the convenience of having to stop and fill up less.
Correct.
So going back to what you said then, really to removing the RFS, how much of an impact would that have on things like the food market? Would that alter it, at all, if any?
It's almost the exact same argument I had just for the moving from E10 to E15, right? We're basically using the same amount of ethanol. We've had this experiment the last couple of years with these sustainable small refinery exemptions. We consume the same amount of ethanol per gallon that we always do. The trick is what can we do to encourage gasoline consumption? Higher gasoline consumption leads to higher ethanol consumption. And so right now, higher gas prices are threatening, the use of gasoline, which then threatens, gasoline consumption and ethanol consumption. So even if we got rid of the RFS, it wouldn't change the amount of ethanol that we're using. And because of that, it's not going to impact how much the price of corn is going to impact the price of food. Very small, minimal changes.
So really, just to recap what you said, that with the levels of ethanol that's already being blended into gasoline for that easy octane to really get that in to meet the fuel standards there, the decreases in the demand for gasoline really hurt ethanol because you're losing those lower blend levels. But if you want to boost ethanol blends into things like year-round E15, we'd run into issues of infrastructure, just people not being able to really utilize it.
Yeah, in the short term, that's what that means. In the long term, sure, there's opportunities to build out better, higher blends of, higher blends of ethanol. But in the short term, higher gas prices would likely mean less ethanol used.
All right, well, some reports to watch. Ethanol, that was today. We have export sales that comes out tomorrow morning. So Ben, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. I'm Will Robinson on Brownfield.